Hello, my name's Sam, also known as the Lazy Lecturer. Today I'm going to just do an introductory video into session planning, sometimes called lesson planning. I'm going to aim this really at the first steps of lesson planning, so for level 3 or for doing a microteach, maybe for level 4. I will be doing another one later on which will be a little bit more advanced, but this kind of session planning should be good enough for most FE institutions, and then you can build on it to enhance your practice. Lots of different session plan templates. It depends on where you are, which one you'll use. So and sometimes you get to choose, sometimes your organization chooses. They'll have a lot of similar elements on that we will see. So you're going to need your objectives, differentiation, assessment for learning and assessment of learning sometimes. And here's another type of template here, content, method, resource, etc. The one I'm going to use today though is this one, which has a lot of elements which are common, especially in FE and community education. So just as a note, I'm calling it session planning today. I might accidentally stumble into the word lesson plan. They are the same thing. I tend to work with a lot of people who are more vulnerable or been disadvantaged by education. So the term lesson plan just reminds them of education they failed in. So I think session plan is a nicer term, especially for community educators. I don't know why that's bold. Okay, so some of the elements that will be constant, and we'll just talk through them, and I've got a bit of an example of a session plan as well. So title, that's just the title that you're going to call your session. Sometimes that information might be on a scheme of work. This session might already have a title. Venue, where are you going to be? You might be in a particular room, in a particular building, or you might be out in the community. So you just note it there. Time, that's the duration of the session. I'm going with 30 minutes here because that's quite common for a micro-teach purpose, and this video is really going to help people with their first micro-teach. At least I hope it does. Tutor name, I've been a little bit unoriginal there with Mr. A.N. Other. Well, it could be Miss or Mrs. A.N. Other. I don't understand why we bother with gender anymore. Okay, because it doesn't really matter. So, aim, outcomes, criteria, it all gets a little bit confusing. So first of all, the aim is what you're basically going to try to do in that session. Now in normal qualification it would come from your scheme of work and or the qualification itself. So in this case the aim is basic home appliance safety of a plug, or safety. Now unit LOs, obviously this is a micro teach, so I'm not taking my LOs or learning criteria from somewhere else. Learning LOs being learning outcomes, learning objectives, learning objects, and you'll find that sometimes they mean the same thing, and sometimes people think they mean different things. Technically they're all the same thing. So if you have a unit or qualification, then the learning outcomes or learning criteria, then include them here, as they will almost certainly come from an SOW. If they're on there, if you've got a scheme of work, really should be there, you note them here. And those will then derive where your session LOs are coming from. If you don't have those, then your session LOs are coming from your aim. And when I say coming from, basically what I'm going to say is something called constructively aligned, in that if the session learning outcomes are achieved, or learning objects or learning objectives, then the aim should be achieved. If you complete those learning criteria, objects, whatever, and they don't meet the aim, then you don't have the correct session outcomes. You need to have more so that you do enough to meet your basic aim. Okay. And if you were taking a learning outcome or learning criteria from a unit or a qualification, then you would be making your session outcomes constructively aligned to those. So if you complete everything that's in your session, it would meet that particular outcome or criteria that you've taken. So I've got here list the steps of general safety maintenance of a domestic appliance, and perform general maintenance on an electrical item. In my opinion, if those two session objects are met, then the aim will be met as well. So therefore, that's successful alignment. Now then, it gets really confusing, so I'll dip into it here. I go into this more in the next video. But quite often in some qualifications, especially with things like a GovEd, you'll get learning outcomes and learning criteria. Learning outcomes will be things like understand how to, or understand the requirements of something. That's what we call a knowledge base. Now, a knowledge base is usually cognitive and will require written or thinking. You will also get be able to demonstrate type outcomes. So, for example, be able to undertake basic home appliance maintenance. Now, what that particularly means is that is a skills-based learning criteria as opposed to a knowledge-based. So for a skill-based, I really should have something that demonstrates that skill in action. In this particular case, the perform is performing the general maintenance, which we'll see a bit later. And also, so the session outcomes that I'm going to use, so the learning object, learning outcome, be able to undertake or be able to demonstrate or understand, are not what we call measurable. So whenever you get a learning outcome like that, it will always, or should always be, broken down into what we would call measurable outcomes, objectives, or criteria. So what will happen in an GovEd unit, you'll have a learning outcome, and then immediately underneath it will be learning criteria. So for example, this one might have learning criteria, list steps of perform general maintenance, identify home appliances, because put together, all together, those three criteria would meet the learning outcome. Okay, you're going to trip over constructive alignment and learning criteria lots and lots as you move through education, but eventually you'll get it. The key thing is your actual session objectives, objects or criteria, are measurable. So, list. How could I measure a list? Well, if they've produced a list, they have listed it. If they have performed, if they've done that physical activity, then they've done it. So it's making sure these are measurables. This is where you're coming into your Bloom's taxonomy of verbs or your solo taxonomy. And also, you can go up the domain. So list is a lower domain. And perform, which is actually putting into action, so contextualizing it, is a higher order domain. So you find this in Bloom's 4, 5 or 6 and list in 1 or 2. Okay, so let's get into the plan itself. So you should always start with the session objectives. Everything is driven by the purpose of the learning and where it's going and what the learner's going to get out of it. No good doing your resources first. Your session objectives should be key. Okay, now I'm coming into template, which is quite simple, just jiggle it into. So I've got a form here, and time is how much time you're going, how much time of your session that takes. Remember, we've only got 30 minutes in this particular one. Some people do it, the particular time. So if your session starts at 9 till 9:30 or whatever, I always think it's the number of minutes that you've got. Now, I've broken one of my own rules here, because I got a 3, a 5, a 5 and a 4. 3 minutes is very short. Now, it makes perfect sense that you think you can do something in 3 minutes. In reality, if you have anything on your session plan that is less than 5 minutes, ask yourself, is that really achievable in less than 5 minutes? It's amazing how timing will become an issue as you carry on. Okay, LOs or LC, so these are learning objects. Outcomes, objectives, criteria for this session. Now, so these are numbered 1 to 2. Now, in this particular case, I've numbered my learning session outcomes here. If I had unit ones, they would have their own numbering on them there. But here, such as, for example, you might have an LO which is 1, and then it would have criteria 1.1 or 1.2, etc. This means I don't have to keep writing down my learning outcomes objects. Here, I can just put those numbers down. Okay, and now differentiated objects. So is there anything differentiated in those? We'll look at that a little bit later on. If you're looking at this because you're doing a level 2 train the trainer, then differentiated objects are quite complex, and only do those if your tutor's going to help. You don't worry too much about them at train the trainer level 2. Level 3 and above, you'll need to do a little bit of that. Level 4, 5, 6, you'll need to have quite a bit. So I always like to just slightly shade my session plan. So I've shaded this one pre-session. Is there anything I'm going to do before the session starts? You know, sometimes you might be sending stuff to your learners, or there might be something. So in this particular case, place images of domestic appliances on the walls. It's going to be making the room match that kind of session. For a micro-teach, sometimes because you have less time and provided your tutors are happy, this could be sharing some of the resources before the session, because that will save you time in the session rather than having your participants have to read during a tight window. Okay, now then I tend to do a highlighted section for introduction. I also do one for plenary. You don't have to do this, but it's a really good habit to get into until you're really confident. So with the introduction, it's the introduction to the session. So it's going to be introduction the learning objects, the aim and or aims, session health and safety if that's applicable. Now in this case we've got things like screwdrivers, so we're going to talk about that. This is where your risk analysis for the room comes in. APL, and I think it's perfectly okay to use shorthand on your own session plans. APL is assess prior learning. So find out if people already know this. If they don't, then that's pretty good because your session plan can go as it's designed. If they do, then you might be adapting your delivery as you go, or you might find that you've got an MKO, a more knowledgeable other, who, when you get to the activity stages, may be able to support somebody else. Okay. There's no point putting that assessing prior learning if you're not going to put it into action or use it later on. Okay, so the learner activity, a lot of session plans will have this teaching learner activity at this stage. Because it's tutor talking, the learners are passive, they're listening and they can ask questions. How will we assess that? Well, T and L, I use T for tutor, L for learner. Questioning. So at the end of that little section, we should be assessing whether or not they understand the learning objects, session, health and safety, aims, etc. Every section of your session plan should have an assessment strategy. It's no good doing the teaching learning if you and or the learners cannot see or gauge where they are, how they're doing and where it's going. Teaching and learning without assessment is not teaching and learning. Embedding, I'm going to come to that in a little bit in a minute. Resources. Now at the very top I've put a whole list of the whole resources. Sometimes that'll be higher up the session plan. Sometimes it will just be noting it as you go down each particular element. Just before I go any further, a session plan, the purpose of a session plan is to allow you to see where you are, to keep on top of things and not forget stuff in a session. And if you're like me, a session plan is really important because I tend to get sidetracked and carried away. But also is, if you're poorly or somebody has to take over, what your session plan is doing is making it possible for another tutor from the same department or similar skill or knowledge that you've got to produce or to undertake that session and deliver it with just the session plan and the resources. So if another tutor from the same department can't make sense of your session plan, then you need to rethink it. But the other thing is you don't want to make it too complicated because you might be referring to this during the session. You need to find stuff quickly. So use shorthand that works for you. Okay. And I'll give you some examples of TTL, teacher learner. And also here, in this one here, which I'm going to come to in a minute, I've got questioning. I tend to just put QUE. Question is fine for me. Okay, so then I've introduced the session. They now know what we're going to be doing. I've shared those learning objects, or shared, as Dylan William calls it, share your learning intentions. Right, into the session, and I'm going to go with quite a stock standard approach. So I'm going to begin with a tutor-led presentation of the general maintenance of electrical items in the home. So I suppose technically I am covering a bit of learning criteria too there. I'm noting the learning criteria that is being met here. So in this particular case, I'm certainly meeting one. I'm going to just say it's one. I don't really think I'm meeting two at the moment. Learning criteria 1. Now note, in the introduction, learning criteria 1 and 2, now that doesn't mean they've been fully covered. It just means they've been partly covered. Obviously, people are going to need to know what they're doing before they can get there. Here, we're going to look at learning criteria 1, which, if you remember, was list the steps required, general safety maintenance. And I got a presentation. It's on my PowerPoint. Or what I should have said is on the first one, I got PowerPoint slides 1 and 2. Slide 1 had the aim, slide 2 had the objects. Here, tutor-led presentation, and I just need enough of what that presentation is going to be for somebody else if they have to do it. So it's general maintenance of electrical items in the home, health and safety for working with electrical items and the equipment needed. And it's my PowerPoint, and it's slides 3 to 10. Now, once again, the learners are passive. I know that you'll have been told you need to get active learning going as soon as possible, or you may have been told you can't have active learning where it isn't present. So elements are going to be passive at times, unless you really can be quite innovative and do stuff in a different way. So if I am leading and I am a tutor and I am presenting and I'm telling people, then their learners are passive at that point. So I'm limited in which assessment strategies I can use. I really, at this time, the one that's most likely to match would be questioning. At the end of that, I check, or as I'm going through it, I ask questions to check as we're going. And during it, the learners can ask questions for elements they don't understand. Embedding or cross-cutting. So ideally, what we want to be doing in all delivery is embedding and cross-cutting literacy, numeracy, digital literacy, ESDGC, environmental, sustainable, developmental, global citizenship, and in Wales, Welsh language and Welsh culture. So you want to look at your session where you can embed that in, and ideally elements which show your participants how it matches to that particular topic. So in this particular case, whilst I'm doing the presentation, I'm going to look at sustainability by talking about the plastic used and location of the manufacturer, because that adds air miles and sustainability, etc. I'm also going to talk about fuse and fuse. I'm not going to go into too much depth because that is a numeracy element, the right number fuse for particular plugs or whatever. I'm not an electrician, by the way. If I was, I would be able to tell you what that really means. And this is only basic. I'm also going to use Welsh language and vocabulary, so I'm going to deliberately use vocabulary of the correct terms for these particular items. My Welsh isn't very good, and I should have prepared myself before this video so that I could have included them here now, but there we go. Right, now we're going to go on to the next session. Now I do, but you don't have to, it just makes life easier for me. I shade, you see this box is grey shade and this box is grey shade. This box is grey shade. I shade elements of my session plan for basically what is more dominant at that time. So these two were tutor activities, which is passive teaching or delivery, and his one here is active. So the learners are more active. So it shows at a quick sight, where the active learning is and where the passive learning is. I like that. It just makes it easy to see. Right, so here I'm going to then move on to what we're going to call a matching activity. They've got a matching activity and they're going to have an activity that's already prepared. Oh, so it's a sequence guide. No, it's not the sequence guide, it's the matching activity here. A matching activity. And in this, they're basically matching the correct order of this, which is going to be checking the wiring of a plug, the correct order of that sequence. So they're putting them number 1 to the right step, number 2 to the right step, etc. And then when it's finished, that actually becomes the sequence guide. So they're going to create their own template for how they do it. So they create this sequence guide. So during the session, they are now active in the fact that they've got this activity in there, putting the right thing to the right number. Now then, during that, the assessment for the learners is they can ask questions. As a tutor, now that they are active, you don't want to be talking all the time. You want to be stepping in if needed or not. So your method is likely to be observation. But also, we've also got something that's really nice here in the observation, because those who are formative so far, evidence. So we've got some good summative assessment evidence being drawn here in the fact that we now have the completed sequence guide. So is that sequence right? Here's evidence that we can show our internal and external quality people. Now, what I could do is making that activity, the matching activity or sequence, is I can differentiate that as a resource. So I could actually have scaffolded for E3, brief scaffolding for E2, no scaffolding for L1, so it's blank with numbers on. And that would mean that I might give some clues for E3 or some clues for E2. And that's just that difference to help cater for levels. So that's one method where you show how your resources or your approach just caters for those different levels. Okay. Differentiated there. Okay, now I've left this section blank. I just want to talk to that at the end of the video. Okay, now the next section is that actually the maintenance. So here it's going to be learning criteria 2, and that's the actual perform the maintenance. Now here I've just put in grey and in brackets like a 1.3 as opposed to 1 and 2. And if I had unit criteria, then this is how I would link them as well. So that helps the quality team see how you're linking your learning criteria to the unit criteria. It also helps you because you can just check, are they actually getting where they're going with their qualification. So facility, this is the activity. So I'm going to facilitate the activity, which is use the sequence guide. Now I'm going to make sure that another tutor has enough on that. So perform maintenance on an electrical item. So they've got to check the cable, they've got to open the plug, they've got to check the wiring, they've got to identify the fuse, and there are a couple of extra steps for those people who are a little bit more advanced, where one of the cables isn't going to be connected properly, so that they could, for example, reconnect that. So all will perform the basic identification maintenance. So they all go through those steps and they say, here's the fuse, here's here, this cable's not connected properly, that's not safe, I need to get an electrician. Some will go, well actually, this is a basic item, this is a basic approach, I can connect that wiring and then just check that it's safe. And a few, if we get time, will perform maintenance on 2 different items. So that's differentiated that object. So you've got all, some, will, or few. Notice the basic, the all, is the more or less the learning criteria that we set to perform general maintenance, because if you don't even meet that, then you haven't met the learning criteria or learning objects for your session. Now the great thing here is they've got the sequence guide that they created in the previous one. Once again, the learners can ask questions throughout, tutor can observe, and the evidence is, well, they will have completed that plug. How do I capture that evidence to share it with external or internal? Well, I can take photos, or I could, for example, I could do a written form, a tutor, I forgot the name of the damn things now, a tutor reflection or a tutor observation of an activity where I would write down what all the learners did. But I would still suggest that even if you did that, taking photos of the learners' work to show what they're doing as they're doing it, and at the end, is good summative evidence material. Okay, Now, and I'm going to embed digital literacy. This time we're trying to put what used to be called ICT. So that is where learners use digital literacy in their day-to-day life, because that enhances their use of it. And in this case, take some photographs during. So they've got a record of them doing it themselves, which would be quite nice. And the equipment, screwdrivers, wire plugs, sequence guide. And then the last element of the session, which is the plenary. Now the plenary is basically closing up your session. Once again, I've highlighted this, and it's a good idea to do this. So this is where you come back to close the session. So like finish the circle. So revisit your session aims and LOs. Have they been achieved? And it's not just a simple, did you do that? Because you get a yes or no answer. It's, how did you do that? Make sure that you really do check them, because learners will say yes, doesn't mean that it's been achieved. So use good questioning. So in here, it is tutor and learner. Tutor, learner. Q. Q is fine, questioning, because questioning laterally means questioning and answering. And here, remember, they were passive, ask and answer questions. And then I just highlight that box. I think it's that shade I'm using. That's just for me. You don't have to do that. Useful step now. Extension activity. Oh, it has to be the two outcomes I use for this session. Extension activities are, if you've got time, what else could you do? So this caters for sometimes you're more able. It makes sure that if you're early, you've got something else to do. So you could have other items that they could plug, check. But if we're going to use, in this case, we're using light fitting. So one end I got the plug, but I got the simple light fitting that they could check as well, because it's just wired slightly differently. Okay, so hopefully that's a good introduction to your first session plan. Any questions, please give me a shout, drop them in the comments, and I'll be doing another one in the future. Thank you for listening.